You know everything about me now. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a real honor, and it's great to see the level of interest. And above all, thank you for letting me speak in English. My Finnish isn't great. I was thinking to myself, it extends to about 2 words so far, cybersecurity. I think that's cheating. I'm going to talk about attitudes to cybersecurity in the boardroom. So how do we push decision-making at senior level in organizations? Let's see if I can master the click. Yep. About 2 years ago, we published our first piece of research. This is freely available at this URL if you want to see a copy. We published some research that looked at the level of information that was present at Boardroom. So we interviewed about 150 C-level executives in organizations. And at that time, we'd just suffered the TalkTalk incident. This was about October 16. And so it was quite high in people's thinking. What did we find? We found that over a third of executives expected to suffer a cyber breach in the next 12 months. Either very honest, very prescient, or an indication that they were starting to think about this. 81% of those we interviewed said that they were about to increase the level of scrutiny that they were applying on cybersecurity. So they were worrying about it. And yet, and there's some interesting statistics around this, only about half of them examined cybersecurity at the boardroom and level agenda every few months. We actually went right down to once a week, once a month, and so on. So there's interesting statistics about how often people talk about this. And that was an indicator of how seriously people were taking this subject. And what we were puzzled by is why, given that level of concern, given the everyday occurrence of cyber breaches in the media, we see a company a day, if not more, hacked, and some very famous breaches. Why, when it's top of everyone's risk list, is it not top of everyone's investment list? And we were really trying to understand what is driving senior decision makers' behavior in cybersecurity. People are worrying about it, but they're not paying for it. So we did another piece of research, again, freely available. There's a URL, and I'll put the URLs up at the end of the presentation. We did another piece of research that looked at the impact of a breach on share price. Now, we were hypothesizing, we were thinking that chief executives, the one thing they care about all else is the share price of their organization, the company valuation. So was it impacted by a breach? And we looked at something like 300 companies. There's the top 60 in this graph, and I'll explain that. And we did that against a backdrop of about 1,000 companies that were their peers. So they were the normal, if you like, to make sure that we weren't factoring in market movements. So we wanted to see the absolute impact of a breach on share price. And you can see from this graph here, what we have here, it's a little bit difficult, and I recommend you download the report and have a look. On the horizontal is peer performance before the incident, and the vertical is peer performance after the incident. So if nothing happens, you'll be on that red dotted line. If your share price doesn't change, you'll be on that red dotted line. And what you see is 2/3 of companies adversely affected by a cyber breach, which is a real difference. And one of the first pieces of evidence, historically, people have suggested that there's no impact on share price over the long term, and this suggests otherwise. If you actually look at the statistics in more detail, look over that sample, we found that on average, the impact on share price was 1.8%. And to put that in context, for a FTSE 100 company, so FTSE is a listing in the UK of large companies, that would cost them £120 million per company for that impact, for the 1.8% impact following that breach. Now that's a serious amount of money for most organizations, and most organizations that's a lot more than they spend on their cybersecurity defenses. We also found, I go back, skip on, right. In some cases, it went up to as much as 15%. So although 1.8% was the average, 15% was the extreme of what we saw. And one of the things that I found interesting was actually, you have to think about this one, when you looked at the companies that were performing well or better than their peers, they were ahead of the market, they coped with a breach, the impact of a breach, much better than companies that were behind their peers. So if you perform well as a publicly listed company and you have a breach, the impact on your share price is likely to be smaller than if you perform behind your peers. So that, again, starts to make you think about, well, what's being judged here? It's indicative that the market is becoming sensitive to cybersecurity as an indicator of value of companies, which I think is quite interesting, quite exciting for the business. So this graph at the top was broken down by when the breach occurred. And what you found was that when we went back to the start of the survey, in 2013, the measurable impact on share price was negligible, 0.2%, nothing. The year after that, it was 1.5%, and the most recent survey that we had was 2.7%. So on average, that lot was 1.8%, but you can see a clear trend there, which means that markets are starting to judge cyber breaches as something that impacts company value. So if you're out there, if you're part of a company, if you're part of a decision-making in a large publicly listed company, be aware of this, that share price is starting to be impacted by breaches. And of course, we're just about to start thinking about the General Data Protection Regulation. So on the 25th of May next year, as I'm sure you know, GDPR comes into force. And part of that, and I'll come on to GDPR, is the obligation to declare a breach. So whereas many companies at the moment suffer a breach in silence, they keep it quiet in the hope that nobody will notice, and in many cases they don't. Once we start seeing, if you think that there are a large number of companies that are appearing in the newspapers now, suffering a breach, wait until next year. That's going to be really interesting. And of course, my suggestion is that that's only going to push up the trend as more and more markets become aware of the impact on the companies. Another piece of evidence, every year CGI does a review of its customers, and in this case we review about 1,300 of our customers right the way across our global footprint in different market sectors, in different constituents, so IT leaders, business leaders, and so on. Again, if you come and talk to us at the CGI stand, we'll tell you lots of the industry trends. But one of the things that I wanted to pick out here, or two of the things I wanted to pick out, was what was their list of investments and concerns and trends that they were looking at. Number one was about becoming a digital business, and I think many organizations will recognize that as a strategically important aim. Number two was growing cyber risk. And we've seen that increase quite substantially over the last 2 or 3 years. You would have thought that people have been worrying about cybersecurity for many years now, but there's a real upswing. And what was interesting was combining that with number three, which was the response to regulatory demands. So I mentioned GDPR. There are some other regulations like the Network and Information Security Directive that has particular obligations for those businesses operating in what is called the critical national infrastructure. So energy companies, telecoms companies, some parts of finance. Number two and number three are cyber and regulatory demands combined. So in our case, cyber and GDPR. So real impact starting to hit the industry. And just for those who may not have been following GDPR too closely yet, it's starting to hit the media in many different ways. People are starting to worry about it. I personally see companies literally we get about a call a day at the moment on GDPR, where companies are starting to understand that there's a lot of work to do in order to be prepared for the new data privacy regime. And interestingly, we probably get as many calls from American and Canadian and the Americans companies as we do European companies. So companies that operate in Europe starting to worrying about the services they provide, the operations they run in Europe. Very interesting times. And forgive the amount of information on this, but if you're not familiar with GDPR, if you are, you will have no doubt heard the headline, which is about the 4% punitive fine if you are negligent with data and you suffer a major breach. That's the thing that tends to grab the headlines, 4% of global revenue. That's a huge amount of money for a large company, and very substantial increase from the current fines that are true in regulators across Europe. And that tends to be the thing that grabs the headlines. But I think actually there's some things under that that are actually, I think, going to prove more challenging. So that's the threat. One of the difficulties, one of the challenges presented under GDPR is the obligation to report a breach within 72 hours of becoming aware of it. 72 hours, that's 3 days, and you have to report that breach. Many companies would struggle to know that a breach had happened within 3 days, that would acknowledge that a breach had happened. Think about the things you have to do within that time. You have to first become aware that there is a breach. Then you have to try and work out what's happened, what information has been lost, who might be impacted. You certainly won't do that within 72 hours. Typical forensic investigations take several days, if not weeks, to actually find out what's happened, unless it's really obvious, like somebody left a laptop on a train or a bunch of papers on a train. And even then, you still don't know necessarily what the information lost has been. And then you have to start going through the process of authorizing, getting the seniors within your organization to say, this is what we're going to say to the regulator. And bear in mind that it's not, although the obligation is to inform your national regulator of the breach, you also have to start thinking about obligations you may have contractually to your customers and to your supply chain. More and more contracts are now being signed that include data protection obligations and include breach reporting obligations, often with much less time than 72 hours. So if I sign one of you guys up as a customer or as a supplier, for my own GDPR obligations, I'm starting to think, actually, if I need to report within 72 hours and you have lost some data that belongs to me, I need to know that you've had a breach within 24 hours so that I've got time to do something about it and report it on to the regulator. So increasingly we're seeing this sort of contractual chain, which is actually becoming very stringent indeed. And people are only just starting to really think about that. A couple of other things that are true in GDPR is the user rights. So the right to be forgotten, the right to portability, the right for the data to be accurate, consents. A lot of existing systems, legacy systems, haven't been built with all of those measures in mind. So there's a lot to do there. So if you haven't thought about GDPR, please do so, because you've got 6 months to do it. And getting it wrong, coming full circle, goes right the way back to if you're a publicly listed company, that could have a real material impact on your share price. And I think over the coming years, we're going to start seeing breaches, data protection, cybersecurity as a real indicator of a company performance, of quality of service. We're going to start seeing customers making decisions on the basis of how secure a company is. Historically, that's been untrue, largely. Companies have had big breaches, and a year later, their customers are still quite happy to do business with them. I think in the future, and we're already starting to see it now, customers are starting to differentiate, to make decisions, certainly at the business-to-business level, increasingly at the consumer-to-business level, We've seen companies completely ruled out of competitions because they've had a breach in recent times, as an example of that. So there's a lot to think about, and I recommend the URL at the bottom, GDP-info, which breaks the regulation down very simply for everyone to read there. So in summary, people ask me, what are the things that I need to focus on? There's lots of technical things you can do, but I think fundamentally, it always comes back to leadership. Your organization needs to have someone at the top of the organization who takes cybersecurity seriously, someone at board level, preferably the chief exec, who understands that. And increasingly this is becoming the case, which I see as a positive thing. Second, and I think this is really important, understand how you respond. If a breach occurs, you need to know what to do, with who, what they each are supposed to do, what their role is, what their authority is. You need to know who your lawyers are, what their phone number is. You need to have them on speed dial. You need to know who your media crisis management people are. You need to know who your forensics experts are. A number of clients I've been into an incident, and it's the first time that they've really thought about it. And they're saying, well, can you recommend a lawyer? You know, a data protection lawyer, because we're not sure what we're doing. We're worried about this thing going viral on Twitter. Can you recommend some media management people, because we're not sure what we're doing? That's not the time to be making that kind of decision. And when you've got 72 hours to think about that, that's real pressure. So set up a response team who know what they're doing, when they're doing, who they're doing it with. Treat cyber as a business risk, not as a technical risk. Don't leave it to the techies and think that it's taken care of. That's been historically true. Treat it as any other business risk. Understand the legal landscape. Familiarize yourself with GDPR. Have a look at NISD, because by the way, part of the national infrastructure is digital service providers as well, so things like search engines also fall under that. And there are additional obligations under breach reporting and preparedness that come under NISD. Don't be afraid to get specialist advice. Don't think you can do it all yourself. You may have some fantastic teams on the legal side, the media management side, the technical side. Don't be afraid to reach out to other organizations that have the expertise to do this. At least make sure that you know who they are and who you reach for. Plan to improve. So improving cybersecurity is something that is something that has to extend forever, effectively. It's not something you can do once, forget it, you're done, you're okay. It's something that you have to build into the business. It needs to be part of your everyday thinking. We're all becoming digital businesses, digital economies, and yet we're not securing those digital businesses. And we need to make that part of what we do. And then finally, think about your supply chain. Think about the organizations that you depend on. Ask yourself how secure they might be. And indeed, there are some parts of the GDPR regulation that insist that you do that. So it's not just about your own organizations. Be demanding of your IT service providers, of your software providers, and other infrastructure providers. Make sure that they are doing the right thing that will support you, because if they have a breach, if they lose their services, it impacts you. So you need to make sure that you're pushing that through. So I'll stop at that point. And I'm hoping that's on time. Do feel free to download the reports, contact me via those means there. Thank you very much.